Modern global terrorism. First of all, what is terrorism? The FBI defines terrorism as the unlawful use of force against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. Okay, that's kind of a mouthful, so let's break that down. It's unlawful use of force, so illegal violence, against persons or property to intimidate or coerce, which means to force against one's will, a government, the civilian population, or segment thereof, so either an entire population or a part of the population, in the furtherance with the aims of political or social ends. So, for example, terrorism is exemplified by this current event that just happened about a month ago. 200 girls were kidnapped in Nigeria by an Islamic extremist group. The group thinks that Western education is a sin. So they went to this boarding school in Nigeria and kidnapped 200 girls. So they kidnapped the girls because they wanted the other people in Nigeria to be afraid to send their daughters to school. So they used that fear and violence and force to try to intimidate the population and ultimately the government with the hopes that girls going to school will be made illegal. Now, if I were a parent and had sent my daughter off to boarding school, I would for sure be afraid that she would be kidnapped if I lived in Nigeria right now. So this is an effective, personal, violent, disastrous means to an end, and they have specific political or social objectives against a government or a group of people. So there's domestic terrorism and international terrorism. Terrorism can come from within a country, and it can come from groups outside of a country. There are several attack methods, such as explosives and arson, which is, as you can see by the pie chart, the most common form of attack in the 25 years displayed on the pie chart. There's also nuclear materials, biological agents, chemical agents, such as anthrax or ricin. They were both sprinkled on some mail and sent to some very important people, and so those were seen as acts of terror. And also using technology as a means. So this is called cyber terrorism. Now, why are these acts committed? There are several various reasons, but 5 of them I have listed here. One reason is ethnic cleansing. A terrorist group might not like that an ethnicity exists in their society, so they might try to purge that society of that ethnicity, of people from that ethnicity. They also might want to damage infrastructure in order to kind of halt the economy and the progress of a nation. And just generally, along with that, to disrupt normal life. They also might have a direct enemy in mind that they assassinate. And also generally to undermine confidence in the government. If a country is attacked, its people might start to lack confidence that that government is able to adequately protect them against violence and disasters and things of that nature. So a government needs the people's support to run, right? So they might not have that support anymore after a terrorist attack. However, you may have an explosive on behalf of ethnic cleansing that occurs from a terrorist group within a country, but to be truly effective, and by effective I mean this in the perverse way of accomplishing the goals that a terrorist organization wants to accomplish, it needs certain things. It needs media coverage, so it needs to be in the public eye so that people become afraid. It also needs to affect as many people as possible and to last long enough to totally overwhelm the society, either economically, politically, socially. This quote from the New York Times I really liked. I thought it really summed up what terrorism was. Terrorism seeks to hurt a few people and to scare a lot of people in order to make a point. People will do a lot of things when they're scared. Think about The things that you are willing to give up in order to save something that you're really, really passionate about. If they're scared of losing something that they really care a lot about, they will give a lot to these terrorist organizations. So this has been going on for thousands of years. Terrorism has. September 11th was not the first act, and it doesn't just happen in America. It occurs in many parts of the world and has throughout history. One of the ones we have talked about in this class even is the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So Franz Ferdinand represented the leadership of Austria. He didn't lead Austria yet, but the Serbian nationalist group, that the Black Hand and Gavrilo Princip, they killed him in order to show what they were willing to do and to scare the Austrians, to intimidate them into giving the Serbs their own nation. So that was their political goal with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But as you know, it leads to World War II. Another example of domestic terrorism is the white Southerners using terrorism against African Americans as part of their defense of white supremacy. And by defense, we mean here protecting and not necessarily justifying. So white Southerners used this terrorism in the hopes that African Americans would become so scared that they would no longer stand up for their own rights. And as we've just learned about, Palestinians used this kind of violence against Jews in Israel in the hopes that the Jews, being so scared of Palestinians and wanting the violence to stop, that was part of the Israeli perspective from last class, hopefully they would give the Palestinians what they want, which is their own government. Now, September 11th was not even the first act against the United States. In 1993, the World Center was bombed as well. And it was bombed by people associated with Al-Qaeda, and it killed 6 people. In 1995, a federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who, as you can probably guess, were not members of Al-Qaeda. They killed 168, 19 of which were children, and injured hundreds more. So this was an example of domestic terrorism. In 1996, the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia were bombed by Al-Qaeda, killing 19 U.S. servicemen. And on July 27, 1996, at the Olympic Games in Atlanta, there was also a bombing which killed 1 person and injured 111. And then finally, on October 12, 2000, the USS Cole, so a U.S. ship in Yemen, was bombed by Al-Qaeda, killing 19 sailors and injured 39. And the reason that the bombing in Saudi Arabia is important is that 19 U.S. servicemen also were killed. And Saudi Arabia and the United States at that time, right after the Persian Gulf, sort of had a pretty good relationship. Checkpoint number 1. Go ahead and pause or keep going and come back later. Okay, Islamic extremism. As you may have guessed, that's sort of the theme that we're going to carry forward with us in this context of terrorism. So there's some important things I want to note about Islamic extremism and some important differentiations between Muslims and Islamic extremists. So these extremists call themselves Muslims for the purpose of achieving varying political and or religious ends, commit these acts of terror. It's been said that only 5% of Muslims globally are terrorists. Very, very small percentage. If we were to use our class analogy, if a class of 20 of you represented all Muslims in the world, only 1 of you would be a terrorist. So 19 of you would not be terrorists. So one terrorist group is Al-Qaeda, and that is a global militant Islamist group founded by Osama bin Laden. Maybe you've heard of him. It operates as a network comprising both a multinational, stateless army and a radical Sunni Muslim movement calling for global jihad. So let's talk about this word jihad. I'm sure you've heard it before, probably last year, and as you may remember, it really means the struggle, but it is often translated in Western societies as holy war. The classical interpretation, what most Muslims interpret it as, is fighting against one's own demons to find the truth in God. So it's an internal struggle for the greater jihad. So it's a struggle against your own thoughts, your own decisions, those things inside you that make you do bad things. The extremist interpretation of jihad is fighting against the opponents of Islam. So this is the outward struggle. It's outside oneself. So therefore, it's the lesser jihad. So a few things to note about Al-Qaeda. They are a well-funded group, so they're very wealthy. They're global, so they don't have really one country that's a home base. There are members of Al-Qaeda all over the world. They're very elaborate because of that, and they're also very smart. That's how they've gotten away with some of these terrorist attacks without being hunted out beforehand. Some Al-Qaeda members work in business offices and are upper-class members of society, and they might even have nuclear weapons. We don't really know. So Al-Qaeda, because they're global, they're kind of really spread out, they're not to be confused with the Taliban. The Taliban is a political group of various tribes, mostly in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. They actually took over Afghanistan in the 90s, and the U.S. has since kicked them out of power, but Afghanistan is really where they've made some significant impact, but also they're influential in Iraq and Pakistani governments. And so they make their people dependent on them purposefully so that if the Taliban left, then they would essentially have no government and it would be bedlam, anarchy. So the Taliban gives them some sort of structure, but it's still a terrorist organization. So they will attack the U.S. if we are on their land. And in addition to that, they tolerate and support Al-Qaeda. So they let Al-Qaeda stay and live on their land. They're cool with Al-Qaeda, but they're not the same thing. All right, September 11th, 2001. 2 planes, as you know, crash into each of the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. One crashes into the Pentagon, and another plane that was headed for Capitol Hill was steered away by American citizens and crashes somewhere in Somerset County in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So nearly 3,000 people died, another 6,000 were injured, and Al-Qaeda members hijacked the planes. So they took control of the planes at gunpoint. I'm sure this is a story that you're familiar with. This was under the direction of Osama bin Laden, who claimed responsibility for these attacks in 2004. So the way they get people to do this is by convincing them that the jihad and that Allah, God, will benefit them in the afterlife if they give up their life in honor of jihad. So if they are suicide bombers, such as these hijackers, they will be granted paradise in the afterlife. So they saw themselves as martyrs, not as terrorists. Checkpoint number 2. So after September 11th, George W. Bush, coins this phrase, the war on terror. So he first declares that there's this war on terror, which is not just a specific war, but a more general war against terrorist groups. So one of the first things he does is create the United States Homeland Security, which was created officially in 2002. And the Homeland Security is security efforts in order to protect the United States against terrorist activities specifically. So external threats as well as internal domestic terrorist threats, that's what Homeland Security deals with. A definition that I found of the war on terror is an international, so that's important, military campaign led by the United States and the United Kingdom, so both of those countries, with the support of other NATO countries as well as non-NATO countries. And remember, NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so that's the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. The campaign was waged against al-Qaeda specifically, but also other militant organizations with the purpose of eliminating them. We wanted to completely eliminate terrorist organizations, which is why it's called the War on Terror. 2 specific wars from the United States broke out of this War on Terror, one of which is still going on. So the first one that is still going on is the war in Afghanistan. So from October 7th, 2001 until this very day, as you're listening, armed forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom along with British armed forces in the Afghan United Front. So this is the Northern Alliance of Afghani soldiers in response to the September 11th attacks. So they wanted to dismantle al-Qaeda and end al-Qaeda's use of Afghanistan as a base. Remember, Afghanistan doesn't have a home base. They do not belong to any country. So they were using Afghanistan, thanks to the Taliban, as a home base for terrorist operations. We wanted to dismantle them entirely and also kick them out of Afghanistan. So that's why the Afghan United Front takes our side. And it is still going on today. The second war that comes out of this started in 2003, known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, and it ended on August 31st, 2010. So, as I just stated, the Taliban let al-Qaeda use their land, so this applied to Iraq as well. And Iraq is still led by Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. We also thought that Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction, so illegal nuclear weapons, as you learned that there are these international laws that govern nuclear weapons, and we thought these WMDs were being held illegally by Iraq. We also wanted to be consistent with that ideal of democracy around the globe, and so we wanted to liberate the people of Iraq from Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. So we come in there in 2003, and pretty much Baghdad falls right away. You can see in the corner here Saddam Hussein's massive statue right outside that mosque crumbles to the ground, and we have democratic elections held for the first time in over 10 years in Iraq. So once we spent our time there and set up a democratic government, then we left Iraq in 2010. So one important controversy that arises out of this whole terrorism, war on terror era is Guantanamo Bay. So this is our military base in Cuba, and it's also known as Gitmo. That's its little nickname. So the facility was established in 2002 by the Bush administration to hold detainees from the wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq. 2002 was before the war in Iraq started. So we put these suspected terrorists in Guantanamo Bay for investigation into their terrorist activities. It's controversial for a couple reasons. The UN and some other supranational organizations and global groups protested the legal status of the United States' presence in Cuba, and they also protested the physical condition of prisoners at Guantanamo. They thought there might be some human rights violations with some possible torture occurring there to extricate that terrorist information. So Obama actually has wanted to close the base, and you may have heard about this in the news. And this possible torture is occurring to prisoners that may not even be terrorists that we're torturing. So he wants to have the prisoners have fair trial, just like a U.S. citizen would get. And there's some pictures of Guantanamo protests in front of the White House. So Saddam Hussein was captured in December 2003 by American forces. He was put on trial by Iraqi forces, and on the 5th of November 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity by Iraqi court, and so he was sentenced to death by hanging and was executed on December 30th, 2006. Our other leader that we are responsible for the death of is the death of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden on May 1st, 2011. You guys probably remember this happening. It was all over the news. And I'm sure you've heard of the pop culture references to SEAL Team 6. So Osama bin Laden had been hiding for years, since 2001, since we established this war on terror. So Obama sent in SEAL Team 6 finally, once we found where he was hiding, and he was killed by SEAL Team 6. In fighting terrorism today, we have advanced security and advanced technology and intelligence. And the war in Afghanistan is still going on. So we are still a military presence in Afghanistan trying to fight terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. Just because Osama is dead does not mean that Al-Qaeda is. Okay, last checkpoint, then you're done.